Hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno and Max Horkheimer. So now we get to the last thesis on anti-Semitism, the seventh one, which wasn't included in the 1944 version of the book, and there's a reason for it. That's because in 1944, while the war was still going on, but after the Nazis lost and the regime of Hitler fell, people were like, now fascism is over. If there are fascists around, then they are probably just a tiny minority who just complain about liberalism, but they are certainly no longer a threat. But in this last thesis, Horkheimer and Adorno point that the same thing was said about anti-Semites in the 19th century. They were just a bunch of liberals complaining about liberalism and expressing anti-liberal opinions, just a bunch of conservative members of nobility or cops who are reactionary, but that's all, nothing to be alarmed by. And so among them, the authors mention the, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Allwards and the Knipelkunzis, I think that's how it is pronounced. So these are respectively the followers of a certain Hermann Allward and Hermann Kunzi, two famous anti-Semitic demagogues and pamphlet writers who gathered a few followers, exactly like Hitler did. The fascists who became, Hitler's followers were only just a tiny minority at first, troublemakers and malcontents, as the authors call them. So they gathered at beer halls and talked shit about, German liberalism, and as such they were bourgeois reactionaries who felt like rebels, because they were like, liberalism has turned us into weak men, and we have, to fix this shit. Kind of like the same shit you hear on the Daily Wire today. So their rambling was still accepted because it was distorted. It was a distorted form of civil disobedience. So what's the worst that can happen? These are just, a tiny minority complaining, and that's it. Like, liberalism tells you that you have the right to protest power, and so that's what they are doing after all. The fascists are just liberals exerting their rights of civil protest against liberalism. Quote, when people voiced anti-Semitic attitudes, they felt like they were being bourgeois and rebellious at the same time. Their nationalistic grumbling was still a distorted form of civil freedom. And as such, their anti-Semitism was just an idea that had as much right as others to be heard in the public space or the public sphere. It was just one option among many. Yet the issue is that their ideas had something specific to it, and that's why it led to the outcome we all know. According to the authors, the whole chauvinistic vocabulary was implied from the start in the adoption of the Volkisch thesis. Anti-Semitic views always reflected stereotyped thinking. Today, only that thinking is left. So chauvinism is when someone pretends to know better than others and supports exclusively their own position, usually a prejudiced one. It's often used to describe men. When men hold prejudice against women, they are chauvinistic, like in that meme where you have, the two guys drinking coffee and they are saying, ha ha, women. So anti-Semites are chauvinistic, and the Volkisch thesis refers to the Volkisch movement, which was a nationalist German movement which started in the 19th century and continued with Hitler and the Nazis, and claimed that only true Germans have a right to the German soil. It was the type of ideology of the blood and soil. So because the anti-Semites were chauvinistic, they were bound to adopt the Volkisch movement, and the problem with that is that they is what the authors called stereotyped thinking. Like, chauvinism can only rely on stereotypes to make its points, and so anti-Semites only think through stereotypes, which is not thinking at all. And this is what's actually alarming. It's that as the authors say, today the only type of thinking that is spread is stereotyped thinking. Even if people are not openly anti-Semite, the danger of anti-Semitism resurfacing and taken over again, or that other forms of fascism can emerge, that danger is still relevant. The liberal democracies of the 20th century are not safe from fascism because everywhere you look, all you see are stereotypes. The authors write, people still vote, but only between totalities. The anti-Semitic psychology has largely been replaced by mere acceptance of the whole fascist ticket, which is an inventory of the slogans of belligerent big business. So, like when people go to vote, they only have to choose between totalities. So a stereotype is a totality. Like, you give a reductive image of someone or something, and that that thing pretends to be everything there is to know about them. It's totalizing in that sense. Just like when I show you, for example, a representation of a minority on the news, and you will be like, these people are really like that in reality, and that's all there is to know about them. So people, when they vote, they have to vote for a totality, but instead of images, they vote for slogans. A slogan basically works in the same way as a stereotype, but instead of people, it is with situations. Like the situation of your country is shitty, well, don't worry, the guy with a catchy slogan will fix it. You don't need to know anything about the situation, no need to know about economics, class struggle, sociology, psychology, etc. Everything, essential is just in the slogan. So in short, it is advertisement. Politics is just a bunch of ads that numbs you and prevent you from thinking by restricting your options. That's what the ad does. It tries to restrict your choice to just its product. Like, you cannot have anything else except what we suggest. So in that sense, advertisement, slogans of belligerent big business have replaced anti-Semitic psychology. People simply accept the status quo because they are told that there is nothing beside it. That's the fascist ticket, which in the asterisk refers to a single list of a party's candidates in the American electoral system. Like the democracies like that of the US, where the authors were living at that time, they are working like the fascist regimes. They propose to you only one program, only one list of candidates, which of course doesn't work for your interests, but because they are only them, you are forced to accept and comply. So when you go to vote for a candidate, you are giving a list of names of people that you don't know and who don't know you, who have no ideas about your interests or your experience, etc. They are completely remote, and you don't know what they are really what they really want or what they are really going to do exactly. You just have a name, and that's basically it. So you feel like you have to accept something en bloc without any nuance. Like when you look at statistical numbers, you get like some sort of package deal each time you're like, let's give a fascist a chance in the public sphere. As they say, anti-Semitism has practically ceased to be an independent impulse and has become a plank in the platform. Anyone who gives fascism its chance subscribes to the settlement of Jewish question along with the breaking of the unions and the crusade against Bolshevism. So those memes about starting packs, when you have a bunch of elements that don't really have much in common, but they are smooshed together into a stereotype. Well, this is how much of the stereotypical thinker doesn't think. The problem of a stereotype is that it reduces everything it represents into a block, where nothing gets to be distinguished from anything. Like, you have to choose an ideology without really knowing its specifics. To be an anti-Semite means that you also subscribe to ideas that go against your interest, like when workers vote for right-wing politics that are obviously against labor rights and unions. When the anti-Semite commits to anti-Semitism, you'll also find that he will be committed to other forms of nonsense, like conspiracy theories about work unions and about communism, and Bolshevism. In other words, people don't know what they are getting into when they subscribe to stereotypes. The anti-Semite, when he's just looking for the candidate that will take care of the Jewish problem, won't see that he's buying also into more than just a Jewish free society, but that he's also buying the ticket of losing labor rights, for example. So not only the anti-Semite themselves don't have any experience with actual Jews, like all they know about them comes from cliches and stereotypes, but the actual views that they are voting for, like cutting social security, for example, or the actual problems that they are experiencing, like poverty or alienation, these have nothing to do with Jews. As they say, when the masses accept the reactionary ticket containing the clause against the Jews, they are obeying social mechanisms in which individual people's experiences of Jews play no part. It has been shown, in fact, that anti-Semitism's prospects are no less good in Jew-free areas than in Hollywood itself. Experience is replaced by cliché, the imagination active in experience by diligent acceptance. So Jew-free is a National Socialist term, and so the anti-Semite isn't better off in whether areas without Jews or in the most luxurious of all places. They are always, afraid that something wrong is going on because they are not thinking by themselves, but they are told what to think by those that they vote for. So To replace experience by cliché means that you take life as if it comes with a manual. You don't need to experience the word, you just need to apply the instructions given by the politicians, the businessmen, the advertisement, the film industry, etc. So each person simply conforms to what they believe, what they believe the guidelines of their own classes are. They take those guidelines to be legit because of the merits they heard about them. They literally look at life like an article in a magazine about cars and aircraft. Like someone tells you that this car or aircraft is good because of its options, and you believe it to be true. Even when you test the car, you don't find it very different from any other machine that has an engine and four wheels. So you just take it for granted because that person is the agent of power to whom you swore allegiance. Quote, the members of each class have to absorb their quota of guidelines on pain of rapid downfall. Just as they need to be instructed on the technical merits of a particular aircraft, so do they too on their allegiance to one of the prescribed agencies of power. And so what you end up with is, people who don't think at all, who let others think for them and tell them what and how to think. And this is justified on the ground that we cannot afford that everyone thinks for themselves, because we have created a system of production that demands that people don't think in order for it to run. So when we live in an age of mass production, where the quantity of products rely on complete standardization of the production process, everything must be organized pragmatically according to just one standard. So it basically means that you have to rely on stereotypes. Stereotypes feel fixed and true. They seem immune to uncertainty and change, which is perfect for producing so many things in a short amount of time. Hence, every judgment capacities are affected by this. As they say, in the word of mass production, stereotypes replaced intellectual categories. Judgment is no longer based on a real act of synthesis, but on blind subsumption. So synthesis here means an active act in which intellectual categories mean experience. You synthesize the ideas in your mind with your actual lived experience. That's how you form a judgment on something. You need the experience with the intellectual category. So mass production, because the processes of production are so big that you don't even know what you are producing anymore, makes it impossible to experience things. The process has been, divided to into so many tasks that you don't even know what you are doing exactly, or what's even the purpose of the task. And as such, you feel powerless and unable to understand what is happening around you. You just do what your boss tells you to do, and that's it. So you have neither experience nor intellectual categories, and so you cannot form any judgment at all. You can't really form any judgment, really. All you can do is make, generalizations based on blind subsumption, like you just go with the stereotype. So you know nothing about Jews, but instead of knowing them, that would be experience. You just go with what Hitler says about them. Kind of like, in Palestine, you don't know anything about Palestinians, and so you just go with whatever Netanyahu says about them. So ironically, this is not a step further from barbarism, but it's actually a regress from progress. This is like when people lived in the state of nature where thinking was limited to the swift decision to throw a poisoned arrow into the target without missing. At those early stages of humanity, thinking was just about gaining direct power over the enemy, over game or the natural resources. It's about, establishing power over the other. When civilization came about, the process of deliberation became a means to counter this kind of thinking. Deliberation is thought to have culminated in liberalism and took on the form of markets. Power now relies not on brute force, but rational exchange between parties. And so this, according to the authors, had the advantage of offering some protection to everyone to counter the verbal poisoned arrow, let's say. The act of judgment passed through a stage of deliberation, which afforded the judging subject some protection from brutal identification with the predicate. So the identification with the predicate is when you say something is X, Socrates is a man, that's the predicate, and so Socrates, the subject, is identified as a man with the predicate. Now the poisoned arrow is seen as a metaphor for the predicate here. I impose on you something, an identification from which you cannot escape. So the thing identified as its predicate doesn't have a way to resist this identification. By telling this object is a tree, for example, and of course, by tree I mean a potential chair or table. A tree is kind of defenseless since it cannot say, no, I'm not a potential chair or table, stay the hell away from me with your axe. So the act of deliberation was supposed to offer people some protection against this direct and brutal identification with predicates. Minorities especially have often suffered from this, and the fact that they were denied access to spaces of deliberation made them all the more vulnerable to being identified with not so positive predicates, right? So in mass production societies, identification with predicates takes over. People are forced to identify with their design tasks in order for the process to run smoothly, and therefore judgments are only restricted to that, to identification with predicates regardless of experience. When identifying something with a predicate without experience and without its chance to resist that identification, well, that is what is called a stereotype. In late industrial society, there is a regression to judgment without judging. So it's in this sense that we are also regressing in late industrial society. We are literally thinking of the most efficient and swift way to throw arrows at others through stereotypes. The person who comes up with the most efficient way of trapping others in a box, that is the winner. It's just a barbaric state of nature of might makes right. And so in such societies, the risks of breeding fascism are pretty high. When we deal, for example, with criminal cases like we deal with mass production, it's going to be quite the bloodbath. Nothing is taken into account in criminal charges besides the economic powers of those involved. If you have the economic power, then you will decide on the fate of the criminal without his chance to plead his case. So money does the talking for you in court, basically. The one without money cannot escape or resist the labels that he receives, and as such, those who are vulnerable will be by their birth they will be criminals because they don't have the economic power to even deliberate, to even say no to the labels that they are assigned. And even those who have the power don't really deliberate either. The system does it for them. It punishes the criminal before they even had to accuse them. It's like the powerful, the dominant, doesn't even need to partake in the process of perceiving the crime. It's like, everything is run by machines, and only those who own those machines are safe those who don't simply end up in trials and concentration camps. When in fascism, the protracted legal process was replaced by an accelerated procedure in criminal trials, up-to-date people had been economically prepared for this development. They had learned to see things unreflectingly through ready-made thought models, the Terminate technici, which provide them with iron rations following the decay of language. The perceiver is no longer present in the process of perception. So basically, the powerful deny themselves any cognition whatsoever, even the passive kind, because at least when they are passively recognizing things, they are still active because you need to focus and memorize the things that you passively learn. But even that they don't have. They simply rely on conventional schemata. This is, if you remember what we said in the concept of enlightenment, is the consequence of the belief in impartiality as justice. The fact that the perceiver denies his own presence in the act of perception gives that act to the mechanisms of the economy. And so enlightenment identifies reason with the economic apparatus, and whatever convention results from the rationalization of the word through economy, then it must be real. In other words, you let the world create itself without any human interference. You give it to computers, to machines, to the economy to plan everything for you, and that's it. You give it to the economy, to these machines to decide who is a criminal, who is guilty, and who is innocent. And so since you didn't use your mind to interfere, you cannot commit any injustice, right? You didn't protect you didn't project, anything onto the world if you let the machines run it. You didn't commit any anthropocentrism or animism. You did justice to the object of cognition through your passivity. And even when you try to take interest in social sciences, the kind of science that's supposed to show you that there is more than what you see on the surface, the perceiver manages to fuck it up there too. Quote, in the field of the social sciences, as in that of individual experience, blind intuition and empty concepts are brought together rigidly and without mediation. So the asterisk there is an allusion to Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. In the footnote, there is a direct quote from the book which says, "Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind." So that's from Smith's translation. It's in the section where he talks about transcendental logic in the first paragraph, which is where the quote is taken from. Kant talks about understanding, how we come to understand something. When I see an object, there has to be something that happens in my mind to understand the object that I am seeing, right? Kant says that in order to be even able to see the object, I must be a sensible creature. Object must affect me in some sense. It must be I must be able to see, hear, smell, taste, touch objects, and so the representation that I get from my senses for intuitions, because they are direct, there is no mediation between me and the representations that I perceive. I know that I am seeing a camera in front of me, and the camera can be not there in reality or look completely differently, but I cannot deny that I am seeing a camera, right? That something is affecting me to perceive that what my brain is showing me. So that's a sensible intuition, or we can just say experience. But to be able to think about that object that provides the sensible intuition, I need a concept. Once I have a concept, then I can understand what it is that I'm seeing. And so if I have a concept in mind, a thought, but I don't have the experience, the sensible intuition, then that thought is empty. It can never take a concrete form. And if I'm just following my sensible intuition without concepts, then I'm not at all understanding what is happening to me or what I'm seeing, and so I am blind. And so that's what's happening in the social sciences at the time of Adorno and Horkheimer. People are just making concepts without any experience whatsoever. And so the mediation between them and the real, the noumena, as Kant calls it, is absent. Or more precisely, the noumena is equated with the phenomena here. Perception and reality are taken to be the same thing. So the powerful can just, remain in their conceptual reality without going into the phenomena, and they can also stay in the phenomena without tapping into the conceptual reality, since they take both experience and theory, both thought and intuition as the same thing. Like I can understand the word without experiencing it, just through formula. And so from there, all opposites become confused. Just like there is no distinction between thought and intuition, between reality and perception, between theory and experience, there is no distinction between truth and lies. And how can anyone make a judgment when they cannot distinguish between truth and lies? In the age of the 300 basic words, the ability to exercise judgment and therefore to distinguish between true and false is vanishing. So in a world where truth and lies cannot be distinguished, judgments are obsolete. Those who look for truth become the priests and the magicians, the idols of the past still trying to act like they are relevant in the present. Truth is itself a superstition now. All that matters is power and mass production. If your thoughts doesn't produce anything, if it's not, contributing to the economy, to the agencies of power, then it is against reason. If we cannot use it to optimize some specialized knowledge in the division of labor to produce more, then it is obsolete. And so it is metaphysical speculation. It is, as they say, suspect as an old-fashioned luxury, armchair thinking. It is supposed to produce something. So mental activity must be as superfluous as work under technology and rapid industry. Anything that can set the process on pause, anything that isn't, computed and turned into an advantage for the labor process must be eliminated. And so error is simply intolerable. This is, of course, coming from the people who don't believe in truth anymore. There is no truth, but you cannot make errors. It's all, politics, like when you want to win a war, right? In war, there is no use for truth. Error doesn't mean that you said something false, but it's something that cost us the winning. And so in mass production, errors cost us more profit. So it is unacceptable to make errors. From this, the same is applied to thought and social relations. No one wants to appear awkward to others or say something weird that can hinder the social process. It doesn't matter what is being said. It doesn't matter what is being said is true or false. What matters is how efficient it is at keeping things running smoothly. So if everyone thinks the Jews are the problem, then trying to think differently will make you come off as weird and awkward, which is, in modern societies, well, you cannot afford that. To think simply means to suppress difference at this point. So even logic isn't tested on the truth or falsity of its results, but whether or not it guarantees the survival of the group. And as such, if logic wants to survive, it itself must be like the group, not caring about truth and simply following, simply looking for the most efficient way to stick around. So it therefore understands that its only way to remain a field of study is by rejecting the particular, the outsider. In an era where neither truth nor lie can be distinguished from one another, logic is given only one task: to separate people into two categories, the foes and the friends. Nothing else matters. Logic becomes a tool for politics, and so the universal is the friend and the particular is the enemy. If even within the field of logic the concept stands opposed to the particular as something merely external, anything which stands for difference within society itself must indeed tremble. Everyone is labeled friend or foe. So we therefore arrive at binary thought. Things are either black or white. You are either an ally or an enemy. You have an oversimplification of social relations, of reality, which is precisely what fascist administration need. Nothing is easier for social control than to disregard experience and subjects and turn them all into stereotypes. The disregard for the subject makes things easy for the administration. Ethnic groups are transported to different latitudes. Individuals labeled Jew are dispatched to the gas chambers. So the problem with logic is therefore that it breeds indifference towards the individual. The individual disappears in the economic process, which is run by formula and equations. And so the result is an actual belief that the individual, by nature, is an obstacle to progress. So the human body and its subjectivity itself become perceived by the same aversion and repulsion that Jews are perceived by. They are signs of regress. Like, no matter how much you want to impose technical progress on individuals, their mind and bodies won't follow. There is always a cultural lag between human beings and technical progress, a lack of synchronicity between the two. So we don't ask any questions. The problem is in the human being. Individuals must disappear. That's what God, progress, is asking. He is demanding a sacrifice. So reason steps in and does the job. It annihilates the individual in rationalized economic processes so that the cultural lag between human and machines disappear. Now, human beings are looked at through the lenses of the economy to make them fit into the model of rationalized economy, which has only two units: business and human beings, with the latter forced to conform to the former's rule, giving that business is the most advanced form of being. The most advanced form at a given time becomes the predominant one. So the authors go through a comparison between what happened to the old-style specialist shop and to the individual in the model of business. The shop was expropriated by something more advanced. Having outgrown mercantilism, it became the factory and free enterprise. Then competition made it turn into centralized, made a turn into centralized retail shops known as the department stores. So the department store is the most advanced form of the specialist shop, therefore the latter must give way to the former. And so that's how business works, and human beings are no different. The authors even use the term the individual to refer to small business. That's what human beings are. They are small businesses. So they too must give their way to the most advanced form. So for individuals, they were expropriated by the unit of economic power. They exist for the sole purpose of satisfying the demands of the economy, like coal fuels the steam engine. They are turned into atomized, isolated units, each fending for himself, whether as working class or as bourgeois. Emancipated from the tutelage of earlier economic stages, individuals fended for themselves alone, as proletarians, by hiring themselves out through the labor market and by constant adaptation to new technical conditions, as entrepreneurs by tirelessly realizing of the ideal type of Homo economicus. So even the psychology of the individual, the small business, is divided into the same process. You have the superego, the ego, the id. The superego is the image that you have to portray. That is the ideal demanded by society, and in this case, the perfect Homo economicus. But you have impulses that, as we said, don't follow and resist this perfect image that denies our basic drives and instincts. And so those impulses are the id, the unconscious drives that can ruin the superego. So the ego is the one who will keep those instincts at bay or in check by negotiating with the superego. So it is in its negotiations with the superego, the ego, the agency of social control within the individual, keeps the drives within the limits set off by self-preservation. So this, of course, puts such a heavy burden on individuals that they cannot help but become neurotic. Neurosis, their right is inevitable, but at least they contend that liberalism and market economies did allow some interplay of subjects, but that was only short-lived. When monopolies and combines became a thing, and then you have the world wars, it's pretty difficult to maintain the thesis that it's individuals who run the economy. Isolated individuals in the text monads, which we will explain in the next chapter, they simply become obsolete. So the old model of personal responsibility, where the individual is negotiating with himself between, id, ego, and superego, doesn't have any impact anymore on the economy. It's not the individual who decides what to do or believe through his psychology, through this psychological inner dialogue. It is the hierarchies, it is society, it is the state, it is the apparatus, the collective that decides for him what to want, what to do, what to believe. Quote, for the human being as a wage earner in the decision for the human being as wage earner, the decision is taken by a hierarchy extending from trade associations to the national administration. In the private sphere, it is taken by the schema of mass culture, which appropriates even the most intimate impulses of its forced consumers. Like the individual must give way to these social forces that are greater than him, since they are his most advanced form. Those at the top, like committees, businessmen, politicians, celebrities, etc., they become the superego and the ego. They are the ones doing the negotiations, while the masses become the id. Their job is to be restricted within the limits set by self-preservation, the preservation of power, of course. So the only challenge that society faces now is how to direct the masses without hindering the process of individuation. Like the id, they are stripped of everything, of every semblance of personality and individuality. But that's how you can maintain the process of individuation simultaneously with control. So the masses, because they become creatures of immediate instinct, they can be manipulated easily by the simulation of pleasure and the ready-made. The masses, stripped of every semblance of personality, are modeled far more compliantly by the catchwords and models than ever the instincts were by the internal censor. So society as a whole is then more efficient than the individual to suppress the id. Therefore, the individual must disappear in front of society, like the old must disappear in front of the new. Individuals must simply stop using their own organs to be autonomous, since the point of those organs, like the brain, is to provide individual happiness. Remember, that's the first thing we said in the concept of enlightenment. The point of enlightenment is to bring happiness. Well, when you got more efficient ways of getting it, there is no point in keeping the old ways around, right? So it is in the interests of individuals to let those cliques mentioned earlier, politicians, businessmen, advertisers, celebrities, do their thing, and they will manufacture happiness to your door. So planning your own happiness when the leaders are doing it for you is kind of redundant and pointless. It just wastes energy that you can use watching the next sitcom or the next blockbuster movie. And as you know, it kind of works. Individuals really sacrifice their own reason for something as unreasonable as adapting to a reality that oppresses them. Quote, the irrationality of the unresisting and eager adaptation to reality becomes for the individual more reasonable than reason. So human beings become both the subject and the object of their own domination. This is, of course, an absurdity by the standards of enlightenment. Reason says that being both the subject and object of your own oppression is a contradiction. It's a violation of the law of non-contradiction, which we also explained in the concept of enlightenment. So the conclusion is that the rational individual is literally disappearing in the age of rationality. The rational individual simply becomes the most irrational being that can exist, the one who destroys himself. The dialectic of enlightenment is culminating objectively in madness. So madness itself becomes the content of politics and of reality as a whole. The global takeover of enlightenment makes that everywhere difference is crushed and denied and is displayed as, a spectacle. They mention this between nations when they all produce everything in the same way, but would like to claim that they are different from one another because of their national culture or something like that. As a dense web of modern communications, the world has become so standardized that the differences between diplomatic breakfasts in Dumbarton Oaks and Persia have to be specially devised as an expression of national character, while actual national peculiarities is experienced primarily by the millions hungering for rice who have fallen through the narrow meshes. So the quote is here talking about how different nations show their leaders displaying their traditional food as a way to celebrate, cultural differences while the population is starving. Dumbarton Oaks is an estate that belongs to Harvard University and was founded by a philanthropist couple, Robert and his wife Mildred Bliss. They were diplomats and they organized, conferences there about what to do with the nation after World War II. And it was a gathering hall for businessmen to think how they can exploit people even more. And for Persia, well, they're referring to the diplomats of the third world who talk about nationalism and their national peculiarities through the food that they display on camera during breakfast diplomatic meetings, whereas the real peculiarities of nations is experienced by the interests of those who are dominated and who are kept silent. So the national identity of the Tunisians, for example, is not experienced by a display of couscous to diplomats when they come to visit their foreign capital, but by the worker class, the minorities, the disenfranchised and marginalized populations who don't appear, on those on those screens. So all countries celebrate their national identity in the same way, through marketing. They simply display images on screens, food, monument, natural parks, all of them turn into McDonald's advertisement for a Big Mac. And when you see a fast food commercial, you see how tasty the burger is and how the meat came from the most, ethical form possible, where the cow was almost happy and honored that its meat would be grilled for this hamburger. But you don't see the exploitation of the earth, climate change, and its, repercussion on the working class, who are, the most vulnerable to droughts, floods, and storms. So people starve while leaders display the tastiest food that they claim is the signature of their own nation. So imagine this: couscous is displayed as the national dish, while Tunisians starve. So the resources are indeed being wasted in a world where waste is deemed irrational. So the whole point of enlightenment is that you don't waste anything anymore. Everything must serve its purpose. Everything must be turned into energy and then into matter. Yet people starve, while the rationality has created more than enough so that famine would disappear. So nations waged war in a world where everything for peace is available, when they have no reason to fight because struggle for resource and markets is now obsolete and anachronistic, like there is no reason for it anymore, while they turn into small blocks of power. When they have no reason to compete anymore, when their antagonism doesn't make any sense, they only become more violent towards one another, and their power is maintained through the support that they get from, the same starving masses. So nationalism works like advertisement by numbing the consciousness of the masses. It teaches only apathy towards others, as the masses are forced into identifying with the nation and its traditional food. As they write, only the total identification of the population with these monstrosities of power, so deeply imprinted as to have become second nature and stopping all the pores of consciousness, maintains the masses in the state of absolute apathy, which makes them capable of their miraculous achievements. So in other words, nation states, those small blocks of power, only maintain an illusion of choice. It maintains that it is out of common sense and free love of nation that people behave the way that they do. Their support for nationalism is left to their own decision, but in reality, the decision was already taken in advance. The politician, like the advertiser, already took the decision for you. You only followed. You feel you feel, for example, that politicians, the candidates in election, are truly two different camps with irreconcilable ideologies. When you feel that the two parties are really different from one another, then you can feel that you did choose between one and the other. But if the differences between them are as staged as the breakfast meetings, that they are only differences on the marketed surface, then your vote doesn't matter. For voting to be effective, the choice must be real, like you did vote for a candidate different from the one you didn't vote for. If, however, both are the same, then why the hell bother with my vote, except to give me the illusion that I am free and that my voice matters in the game of politics? How is this any different from when someone buys a ticket to a movie and not another movie? So when I buy a ticket to go see the Avengers instead of Justice League, did my ticket really have a point? Is there really a difference between Marvel and DC? And so the same is true about political parties and international relations. Ticket thinking, a product of industrialization and its advertising, is being extended to international relations. Whether a citizen chooses the communist or the fascist ticket depends on whether he happens to be more impressed by the Red Army or the laboratories of the West. So basically, to be a Tunisian or a Democrat or a communist is the same thing as buying a movie ticket. I have my ticket to the party, to the ideology, to the nation, which makes these things fetishes. The ticket to the movie, if you remember that, what's a fetish, in Marxism, it's something that hides from you the power mechanisms of the production process. So the ticket hides, for example, the conditions in which people have produced the movie. Those who work to make the cameras, the settings, the mic, the chairs on which the director sits, etc. Those who starve for rice. So likewise, ideologies, parties, and nations do the same thing. They act as if your action is free when it is the result of economic processes and power structures that made you buy your ticket and the conditions in which the ideology was produced. Hence, you take the ideology as reality. You don't consider, for example, that even if you acknowledge the power structures, that those structures are historical, that they are, social constructions made by human beings. You will, for example, consider it natural that some must rule and others ruled. And so this is a reification of the subject. The subject is fragmented and then reassembled in ways that fit that ideology. It's like a conditioning that is so strong, but it's only strong because the masses passively accept it. So it's so strong that anything that is obviously true and contrary to the ideology is taken to be a hallucination or a fantasy of an idealist dreamer. Quote, the reification by virtue of which the power structure made possible solely by the passivity of the masses appears to those same masses as an iron reality, has been consolidated to the point where any spontaneity or even the ability to conceive of the true state of affairs has necessarily become an eccentric utopia, an irrelevant sectarianism. Illusion has become so concentrated that to see through it objectively assumes the character of hallucination. So the subject is kind of trapped in a dilemma. On the one hand, he rejects buying the ticket because he sees reality, but then he'd be called insane. Like, imagine that you are living in such a world where even seeing reality becomes hallucination, where the reality itself, truth, becomes labeled a hallucination. And on the other, he accepts the tickets and participates into the illusion. Like, he just adopts to it and sees what power he can gather in there. Like, in order to say the truth, you have to admit that you don't have the truth. The liar tells the truth, while the honest and spontaneous man is the one who lives in fantasies and lies. Quote, to vote for a ticket, by contrast, means to participate, to practice adaptation to illusion petrified as reality, which endlessly reproduces itself through self-adaptation. The reluctant voter is therefore ostracized as a deserter. So this is the madness that proliferates in politics. Voting turns against its own purpose. When people vote, they vote for a ticket. They have to choose an ideology, an illusion to adapt to, and therefore to remain trapped within the power structures. Voting is another tool for emancipation that becomes appropriated by the system. Another tool that was supposed to work for the emancipation from manipulation and lies, and it becomes what maintains manipulation and lies. So it's a tool that is supposed to bring in the rational side of people, and yet it is done to bring the irrational both in people and in ideologies. So those who abstain from voting are often labeled as ungrateful deserters because they refuse to play the game. They refuse to enter into politics, which, forces them to choose an ideology. And so the reason why people who don't vote scare the power structures is because without those votes, the power structures lose their legitimacy. It's kind of like being forced to watch a movie that you didn't buy the ticket to. I haven't paid for my ticket, so why are you showing me this movie? Without my vote, without me buying the ticket, you cannot have my consent. So if you force yourself on me, you did it by tyranny, and so you don't have any legitimacy. So that's why when people don't vote or hesitate, the whole elite class goes berserk. They all know that in order to establish their power, they need the vote. So the time where someone stops and asks and thinks about what they are about to do is a threat to the system. When we hesitate, when we don't, go in, when we don't give the vote, then we have already escaped to some extent the power structures. So hesitation to play the game means that the conditioning isn't absolute. There is still a crack in the ideology that opens on reality. So people are like Hamlet. When he hesitates, he opens the question of being, and there the whole play, the drama, the whole action is suddenly interrupted and suspended. But in that suspension, Hamlet's thought and humanity is made apparent. Since Hamlet, hesitation was for modern people a sign of reflection and humanity. So that time, the time that he takes to ponder the question to be or not to be, is by modern standards a wasted time. That time shouldn't have been used to run a factory machine or something. That time should have been used to run a factory machine or something. But what that time shows is the gap between Hamlet and the universe, his particular being, the situation in which he is in where he has to choose between two irreconcilable options, is what shows his humanity and protects his individuality from being absorbed by some sort of universal. But that time is banned in the culture industry. To realize the gap between the individual and the universal means that the individual realizes his gap with the machine and with progress, and that is unacceptable today. People must feel like buying their ticket is a second nature for them. The universal is buying the ticket, everyone must buy their tickets, everyone must go to the theater. But those who be like, wait a second here, and start thinking about what they are doing, like Hamlet, and realize how far they are from the universal, those are a threat. So they can suddenly stop working and begin to unionize, turn into Luddites, or go on strikes. And so that the system cannot afford. Wasting time is not affordable by your boss. For your boss, sorry. The wasted time at once represented and mediated the gap between individual and universal, as circulation does between consumption and production in the economy. Today, individuals receive their ticket ready-made from the power that be, as consumers receive their automobiles from the sales outlets of factories. So hence we enter to a more radical stage of the dialectic, which is its suppression. Since everything is already made, the dialectic itself becomes unnecessary. Like the dialectic of enlightenment isn't just the enlightenment turning against itself, but even the dialectic itself is turning against itself. Even the antithesis to the thesis becomes itself the thesis. And antithesis requires that wasted time, where it tells to the thesis, hold on a second. So the individual needs to be in an antithesis with the collective or with the universal. But the process of totalization has been brought to such a level that even the last phase of the dialectic, the synthesis, is no longer needed. When thesis and antithesis clash, they're supposed to form a synthesis, which for Adorno and Horkheimer was still totalizing, but at least it recognizes that wasted time between thesis and antithesis. Now, not even that is acknowledged. The dialectic itself joins superstition, myth, magic, and metaphysics. And from now on, everything is decided from the start, which hinder every possible dialectical process. The industry decides firsthand about adaptation to power. Quote, conformity to reality, adaptation to power are no longer the result of a dialectical process between subject and reality, but are produced directly by the cogs and levers of industry. The process is one of liquidation instead of sublation, of formal instead of determinate negation. So adapting to power through synthesis becomes obsolete and must therefore be replaced by a more efficient way to adapt to power. Instead of synthesis, they argue that adaptation to power works through liquidation. In synthesis, the subject was at least, sublated in the synthesis. Sublation is a Hegelian term. In German, it's Aufhebung. Not sure of the pronunciation. Again, that means when someone is destroyed, but something is destroyed but preserved. So that is determinate negation. It is a negation that also determines you. Concepts work like that. By recognizing a cat, I am negating the cat, but keeping it in the concept of a cat. So although the concept is not a cat, all cats are recognized by the concept of a cat. So in the case of thesis and antithesis, both in the dialectical process, they are negated but also preserved in the synthesis. Like in the synthesis, both find their due share. The subject still remains existent in the synthesis. Your nation, for example, if it's seen as a synthesis of the will of its individuals, despite putting restrictions on you, still recognizes you. So they argue that when there is a disproportion between the collective and the individual, tension is negated. Like the nation imposes conformity on the individual through pressure, through laws and regulation, but also the individual can enjoy advantages. So that the tension between individual and the collective is kind of eliminated. However, in the later stage in which Adorno and Horkheimer write, they argue that reconciliation is at all impossible because sublation is no longer required, where we have a harmony between omnipotence and impotence, like the collective who is omnipotent and the individual who is impotent. They simply work together towards the same goal. The collective has direct control over the individual. It is unmediated control between two antinomies. So the tension that had to be eliminated in the first case acknowledges that there is an asymmetry between the two, but to say that there is a harmony between omnipotence and impotence, we are talking about an open contradiction. In their words, the antithesis of reconciliation. So we don't have sublation anymore. Instead, we have liquidation or formal negation. Things are just negated here, but simply on the formal aspect. What is essential about them isn't preserved, but actually extinguished. What is essential about the subject is, of course, his individuality, experience, subjectivity, etc. These things which guaranteed the tension with the collective are labeled superstition and have therefore no place in reason, no place in rationality. To base everything on rationality means that individuality doesn't make sense. Everyone arrives in a world where everything has already been decided upon. So individuality and subjectivity imply the possibility of choosing something else than rationality, than what was already planned and computed, something different, something new. And that is, of course, unacceptable. There is no other option except what we bring you, no other options besides wars. And so the authors simply look at how these leaders shed the blood of whole earth, populations of the whole earth like maniacs and manage to sleep like babies because that's all done according to the plan of rationality. Precisely therein lies their perfect rationality, which coincides with their insanity. And so this brings us back to the idea that individuals no longer exist in the modern age. But this doesn't mean that the characteristics of individuals have gone missing. What makes an individual is still around, like personalities, tastes, thoughts, quirks, behaviors, etc., the psychological types, as we call them. These are still around, but they are just being manufactured and administered to individual. Like among ideologies, parties, and nations, people also buy tickets to their individuality. However, these character types are now being assigned to their mathematically exact positions within the coordinates of power. Both their efficiency and their coefficient of friction are included in the calculation. The ticket acts as a gear wheel in this process. So what this means is that the character types, the personalities if you will, are assigned through calculations, and even their differences, which can lead to tension, are organized in such ways that they will cooperate into the growth of power. Like if I have a personality that is in tension with yours, the system will find a way to make them both serve the system. It's kind of like in HR, where you try to solve conflict between people, but for the sake of productivity. Like you try to come up with management techniques that will make them both work together and more efficiently. And so the personalities were already assigned so that they conflict, so that the system becomes better at managing it. For example, you can think of the play by Sartre, No Exit, Huis Clos in French. It's not mentioned in the book, but I think it can be helpful. So in the play, you have three characters who are in hell. And hell is just a place with many rooms, kind of like a hotel, and you get a few people together in a room in which they spend eternity, and they will just torture each other. Like no need for demons or guards, you put people together and they will do the torturing themselves. So the system makes each person buy the ticket of their personality, gives the impression that our character is free and that we choose to be, who we are, but in reality we are giving characters to make us interact in a certain way with other characters for the sake of the system. And so as such, even characters that psychologically are determined irrational, compulsive, or unfree come to serve that system and adjust to it. The system makes sure that every artificial personality, no matter how destructive it is, can be kept as long as it serves the system. So the perfect example is precisely the anti-Semite, whose irrationality is perfect for the system. The anti-Semite is, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, a personality of the reactionary ticket, which is, in their own words, is suited to the destructive conventional syndrome. So the conventional syndrome for Adorno is one of the syndromes of what he calls the authoritarian personality. Adorno wrote with other scholars a book called The Authoritarian Personality, where he proposes an approach to spot potential fascists based on questionnaires and see how high people score on what he calls the F scale. F stands for fascists. The study was to spot, potential fascists in the U.S. after the World War, because, as we said, with the Nazi regime gone, people thought that there would be no anti-Semitism anymore, but Adorno was skeptical, and he was like, yeah, there is still fascists around, and or people who can turn into fascists at the first occasion. And even decent people have tendencies that can be unleashed under the right conditions, he thought. Now, yeah, that book relies on a lot of empirical data, which for many they saw it as a contradiction in Adorno's work. We already mentioned this in the introduction, or it was in the afterword, I think. But anyways, that's beside the point. So for Adorno, the authoritarian individual exhibits some syndromes. Among them, are surface resentment, rebels, psychopaths, the crank, the manipulative type, authoritarian syndrome, and conventional syndrome. Now, this one, which is the one mentioned in the text, is based on external stereotypes, but becomes part of the individual, like internalized. The individual can no longer distinguish between what is conventional and what is internal. He takes whatever comes from the outside, like his own actual personality. So this confusion can go as far as creating ignorance about one's own prejudice. The conventional syndrome sometimes he's not even aware that he is prejudiced, let's say. So it's a personality that is basically conformist. The individual, by identifying with the group, by being, conventional, is by necessity conforming to the standards of the group and looks at the world only through in-group and out-group schemes. Whatever divides from the in-group is met with hostility. And so the point of this syndrome is that Adorno argues, since it is a ticket, it doesn't really matter if Jews actually exist for the anti-Semite to exist. Like, the ticket simply creates the anti-Semite because all that is needed is the conventional syndrome. You just need to be in a group and identify with that group, but can only do so if there is an outgroup. So even if there are no outgroups, you will create one. You will even you will invent one. Even if you don't have any experience of Jews, the elements of anti-Semitism will be mobilized by the ticket. A conventional personality, according to Adorno, when it has no reflective element in it, when it is just, a ticket, will bring with itself elements of anti-Semitism. Like we said, it's a package deal. The elements of anti-Semitism, once derived from experience and now rendered inoperative by the loss of experience, reflected in the ticket thinking, are remobilized by the ticket. And this, for Adorno and also Horkheimer, this is alarming. The latent anti-Semitism of the conventional syndrome, or the openly admitted one of the neo-anti-Semites, the ones who are, reappearing in American culture, can be even as dangerous as the Nazis, because, like the Nazis, the lack of experience played a crucial role in dehumanizing the Jews. Without that experience, the neo-anti-Semite can let the neo-anti-Semite can let his imagination run wild based on the already not very flattering stereotypes he has. When the object of one's hate is missing, evil becomes, insatiable. You can never satisfy your hostility because the target is never there. Just because the psychology of the individual can now construct itself and its content only from the synthetic schemata supplied by society, contemporary anti-Semitism takes on its empty but impenetrable character. The Jewish middleman fully becomes the image of the devil only when economically he has ceased to exist. So economically ceasing to exist means exactly the same thing as when starving people are no longer considered in the national dish. It's not the economy that makes the particularities of those people, meaning their material conditions, but an abstraction. Like those starving people, once they disappear, once the peculiarities of the nation is transposed from the material conditions and economic struggles to the diplomatic breakfasts, unfettered violence can easily be unleashed on them. We can go on and take even more liberties with the stereotypes. You get to a point where you hate knowing you hate knowing, you hate knowing why. With German Nazis, it was exactly the same thing. You dehumanize an outgroup, you make them economically insignificant and impotent, and from there you become completely obedient to any figure of authority within the in-group. Whatever the authority asks of you, you will do without even questioning why, without even knowing why. So when the conventional syndrome takes over, the individual becomes a mere spectator of his own actions and feels like he is exempted from all responsibility. Victory is thus made easy, and the anti-Semitic family man becomes the spectator exempt from responsibility of an irresistible historical tendency, intervening only when called to do so by his role as an employee of the party or the Zyklon gas factories. So the Zyklon, or I think it's Zyklon, the Zyklon gas is the gas that was used in the gas chambers by the Nazis. Whatever the factory demands, you have to manufacture. That's your role, your task. You just obey, and as such, people just grow indifferent of most, heinous acts, without knowing why, without knowing the history behind their hate, the historical economic mechanisms that made the Jews the go-to scapegoat, as we explained in the previous thesis. Individuals simply rely on the conventions of their in-group. They apply the economic sentences and the decrees on the out-group without knowing why. Their parents told them to hate them, and that's all they need. The peculiarities for the sake of which the victim are killed have long been effaced. And so this erasure of the peculiarities take on a whole other level in post-Holocaust democracies, where even the Jews are not immune from ticket thinking themselves. Since religion itself was absorbed into cultural heritage, the Jews are themselves open to the totalizing nature of progress. They simply become interchangeable with any other group, which also affects them too. The Jewish masses themselves are no more immune to ticket thinking than the most hostile youth organization. So the figure of the Jew as the devil becomes so widespread that it can be placed everywhere on the globe. The Jew, the object of paranoia and anti-Semitism, becomes an image that can be invented everywhere. All forms of prejudices become anti-Semitism, since the image of the Jew is reproduced everywhere. And as such, global paranoia sets in. It's no longer the individual persecutor, the individual anti-Semite who is paranoid, but paranoia becomes a global and international phenomenon. As I write about paranoia's goal, having become a vital component of society, it must locate that goal within the delusive context of wars and economic cycles before the psychologically predisposed national comrades can support themselves on it, both inwardly and outwardly, as patients. So paranoia becomes like the new opium of the people, and it fuels all nationalist sentiments, nations who are again turned into hegemonies, who are becoming undifferentiated from one another by adopting the same process of production, the same culture industry. They must find a way to keep the masses distracted. And that way comes in the form of paranoia, which they arouse by launching, wars, for example. They will keep it until paranoia has been internalized, that even without wars being waged or planned, the subjects would seek paranoia. It will become like a drug that a patient needs to stay sane. But people can still object to the authors that while it is true that ticket mentality supports anti-Semitism and paranoia, it can also be argued for doing the opposite. Like, ticket mentality is a threat when it is destructive, conventional syndrome, when it is, the anti-Semite ticket. But what about progressive tickets? Progressive in the sense of, morals here, not in the sense of technology. Sure, tolerant personality can be a ticket too, if those tickets are produced by the same system that produces the anti-Semitic ticket. Then there can be hope that we get rid of the bad tickets while preserving the system, which is undeniable, has lots of benefits. So if anti-Semitism is reduced to just that, to just an element on an interchangeable ticket, then changing the ticket would solve the problem. And even more so, the leaders can just direct the anti-Semite tendencies into more acceptable forms of hostility, forms that don't threaten the lives of actual people, or, they can change the target. This is exactly like management techniques that try to channel disagreements or conflict in the workplace. You try to find ways to turn violence into your advantage, like when we say that people are inherently violent, and so we will channel that violence rationally so that we don't murder anyone, like, for example, you put it in sports. So yeah, instead of people murdering each other on battlefields, they can just compete with one another on football fields, or they can just see a display of violence from a safe distance, like when you watch a movie about war, for example. So on the one hand, you can turn those violent tendencies into a spectacle, which means that you can make them safe, turning personalities into tickets, which means that you can turn violence into just a spectacle that people can experience from a safe distance. Instead of killing people on the street, you can just see violence while playing GTA. But this is a problem because, sure, you may be less violent when the violent elements of your personality are turned into tickets, but that doesn't mean that the actual violence isn't taking place, that people are not being murdered, tortured, exploited. At least if you are going to turn the violent tendencies into simulations, you cannot do that with the good tendencies like tolerance, critical thinking, empathy, etc. They must be real if you want a human world. But as we said, the process of turning tendencies into tickets doesn't acknowledge that it has limits. Like it turns violence into commodities and simulation, it will also turn generosity, tolerance, empathy, critique into a commodity as well. Quote, the transition from those conditions to a more human state cannot take place because benign and malign tendencies suffer the same fate. So both tendencies will become a spectacle. What you will get in the end, it's not a world without mass murder or wars or famine or exploitation, but a world of people indifferent to those things. You will just produce the ticket of the progressive personality, but that won't affect the power structures that make social progress impossible. So the progressive ticket is like people talking about freedom and exhibiting it on their appearance all day, but never getting to experience freedom. So experience is lost here too. Sure, the progressive ticket personality will be more tolerant and more attracted to freedom than the conventional ticket, but if you want to put a stop to prejudice and discrimination, you need real freedom, not a simulation of it. The freedom of the progressive ticket is as far removed from the existing political power structures to which progressive decisions necessarily lead, as hostility to the Jews is external to the chemical cartel. So the issue isn't which ticket should we buy to put an end to anti-Semitism or prejudice, which candidate is the real progressive one. No, the issue is the ticket mentality itself, because whenever the ticket mentality is present, difference is absent. To be sure, the psychologically more humane are attracted to freedom, but the advancing loss of experience is finally turning even the supporters of the progressive ticket into enemies of difference. It is not just the anti-Semitic ticket which is anti-Semitic, but the ticket mentality itself. So for Adorno and Horkheimer, as long as there is the ticket mentality, then the rage against difference will exist and will not be just a simulation. The ticket mentality is only possible in a world of domination where the subject of that domination cannot live without a certain rancor against a certain minority. Where there is domination, there is a scapegoat. The rest is to determine who will be that scapegoat. And so that scapegoat can never be the elite, of course, since the elite is harder to pin down than minorities. The system is like, combine of an intertwinement of property, of ownership, control, and management that you never know where the responsibility of the elite lies exactly. Therefore, the default choice is a group that can be easily identified, that cannot resist the process of identification. Hence, the scapegoat will be a vulnerable minority, an abstract difference from the majority. So the ideology of race and class allow that minority to become visible. However, the content of the progressive and the fascist ticket are different. It is true, as they say, although the progressive ticket tends to produce something worse than its content, the content of the fascist ticket is so vacuous that it can be maintained as a substitute for something better only by desperate efforts of the part of the deceived. Its horror is that of the blatant but instant lie. So the difference resides on how much the deceived, the fascist, must make efforts to maintain the lie. This is important because it implies that buying the ticket, the fascist ticket, is a question of will. People willfully buy into the ticket and they willfully make efforts to avoid facing reality. So the fascist ticket does this with an even more insistence than the progressive ticket, which, as we said, is responsible for the economic situation. Like the progressive tickets lead leads to the economic situation that engenders the fascist ticket. So again, it's not a question of choice between the two, but since the fascist ticket is based on light and on truth, it can only be effective if the masses voluntarily abstain from thought. As they say, while it admits no truth by which it might be measured, its absurdity is so monstrous as to bring a truth negatively within reach, so that it can be kept apart from those deprived of judgment only by their total abstention from thought. But thought, as the authors insist on, is criticism. To think is to be critical. Therefore, critical theory must exist, and it is only by embracing that people can be free from the ticket mentality. Hence, as we said, to be enlightened is to be enlightened on the limits of enlightenment. It is only by being aware of the limits of enlightenment that we can be maybe save enlightenment. And that's why the chapter on anti-Semitism is called the limits of enlightenment. Like, we have to address the issue of prejudice, and more precisely of anti-Semitism, which is understandable given everything that was happening in the 30s and the 40s in Europe, like why anti-Semitism would be their primary focus. So as we see, the Frankfurt School doesn't reject reason or enlightenment, but rather say that enlightenment needs to be critical of itself, and therefore it has to know itself. Only then enlightenment and its values can become a reality. Enlightenment itself, having mastered itself and assumed its own power, could break through the limits of enlightenment. And that's it. So that's the chapter on anti-Semitism. Next time we will start reading from the last chapter, which is Notes and Sketches. It is a very strange and peculiar chapter. We will talk about its structure next time. And so that was the last thesis on anti-Semitism. So basically, people think that after the Nazi regime, anti-Semitism and fascism is over, but Adorno say that as long as we continue with the values of enlightenment, and without critical thinking, of course, then anti-Semitism and fascism are still going to emerge again. And they notice that in American society, everything is already in place for anti-Semitism to make a comeback, because there is this thing called ticket mentality and stereotyped thinking. All right, so that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed it, and that you find it easy to read these difficult books. And as always, thank you for watching.